Emma Mitchell had been a normal, chatty 7-year-old girl before the night everything changed. Often told people that Emma had inherited her father's gift for storytelling, at least the version of Richard Mitchell that existed before his drinking became uncontrollable. Emma would talk endlessly about her school friends, her dreams of becoming a marine biologist, her favorite cartoon characters, the elaborate fantasy world she created with her stuffed animals. She sang off-key in the shower. She laughed at silly jokes. She asked 1,000 questions a day, kept a journal of Emma's funniest observations, pure gold from the mouth of a precocious 7-year-old who saw the world with unbridled wonder and curiosity. But that was before. The night that broke everything. It happened on a Tuesday in March, 2 years before the courtroom drama would unfold. Richard had picked Emma up from school for his weekend custody, remembered standing in the driveway, waving goodbye, watching her daughter's small hand press against the car window as Richard drove away. He was drinking then, suspected it though he. The signs were there. The trembling hands, the rage that emerged over trivial things, the smell of whiskey masked by mints. Richard's new girlfriend, Jennifer, had moved into his apartment just weeks before, and the transition had been rough. Emma struggled with the presence of a stranger in her father's space. That Tuesday evening, Jennifer said something. Later, the police reports were vague about the exact trigger. Emma had allegedly left toys on the kitchen floor. Jennifer had stepped on one and twisted her ankle. Richard, already 3 drinks deep, exploded. Never heard Emma's version of events in detail because Emma simply stopped talking about it. The police report stated there was shouting, things being thrown, Jennifer crying. A neighbor called 911 around 9 p.m., reporting screaming. When arrived at the police station to pick up Emma, her daughter was wrapped in an oversized police officer's jacket, her tiny frame dwarfed by the fabric. Emma's eyes were wide and glassy, traumatized beyond words. She wouldn't look at, she wouldn't speak. The officer who handed Emma over had tears in his own eyes. "She's in shock," he said quietly. "You might want to get her to a pediatric psychiatrist." Richard was arrested that night. The charges were eventually reduced because Emma wouldn't testify, because Emma wouldn't speak at all. The first week thought it was temporary, a psychological response to trauma that would fade with time, safety, and love. She was wrong. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Emma began kindergarten that fall in complete silence. Teachers called constantly. Other children asked why the new girl didn't talk. Emma further becoming almost invisible in her quietness. Tried everything. Dr. Martinez, a child psychologist, saw Emma twice a week for 8 months. He was kind, patient, creative. He used drawing, music therapy, play-based interventions. Nothing worked. Emma could write. Emma could point. Emma could communicate through elaborate hand gestures and drawings, but her voice remained locked away, sealed behind whatever trauma had fractured her mind. Speech therapists ran auditory tests. Emma's hearing was perfect. Neurologists ordered an MRI. There was no brain damage. An ENT examined her throat and vocal cords. Everything was physically normal. The conclusion: selective mutism, a rare anxiety disorder where children can speak but cannot due to severe psychological distress. The prognosis was uncertain. Some children recovered within a year or 2. Others struggled for decades. His heart broke in 1,000 pieces every single day. She watched her vibrant, talkative daughter fade into a quiet ghost of her former self. Emma stopped singing in the shower. She stopped laughing. She moved through the world like a shadow, present but not really there. The school year that followed was torture. Emma's second-grade teacher, Mrs. Henderson, was compassionate but overwhelmed. Bullying began subtle at first, then more overt. Kids mocked her for not talking. They mimicked her hand gestures mockingly. One boy told her she was creepy and scary. Emma would come home with her eyes red from silent crying, tears without sound, which somehow made it worse. Richard fought for custody changes anyway, claiming wasn't managing Emma's condition properly. The legal battles drained emotionally and financially. She was a high school literature teacher making $45,000 a year. Richard's lawyer, David Thornton, was expensive and merciless. Hired Hayes, a decent but less flashy attorney, and they fought him off, barely. By the time Emma was 9, was desperate. Therapy wasn't working. Medication made Emma sleepy but didn't restore her voice. School was becoming a nightmare. Lay awake at night, wondering if her daughter would ever speak again, if this broken version of Emma was permanent. It was Hayes, her attorney, who mentioned the possibility of an emotional support animal. "There's research on dogs helping traumatized children," said during one of their legal strategy sessions. "It's not conventional, but it might be worth exploring." Was skeptical. She had never owned a dog, and she couldn't afford an expensive trained service animal. But desperation makes people try impossible things. That summer took Emma to Riverside Animal Rescue, a sprawling facility just outside of Cleveland. She wasn't looking for a specific dog. She just wanted Emma to experience being around animals, to see if the interaction might help. They walked the rows of kennels, past barking dogs, jumping dogs, dogs that pressed their noses against the chain-link fences seeking attention. Then they found Scout. He was in the far corner of the shelter, away from the chaos. A 3-year-old German Shepherd mix with an ear, a patch of gray in his black and tan coat, and eyes that looked ancient and sad. His file said he'd been rescued from an abusive home, chained in a yard without shelter, underfed, beaten. He'd been at the shelter for 7 months, passed over by adopters who wanted younger, prettier, less damaged dogs. Emma stopped walking. She stood in front of Scout's kennel, absolutely still. Scout lifted his head and looked at her, really looked at her with a recognition that seemed to transcend species, held her breath. Emma raised her hand slowly to the fence. Scout approached, his tail not wagging but his entire body loose and relaxed. He sniffed Emma's fingers gently, then pressed his nose against the chain link, holding it there. No sound came from Emma's throat but saw something shift in her daughter's face. For the first time in 2 years, Emma's lips curved slightly upward. A smile, small but real. "We'll take him," said to the shelter coordinator, tears streaming down her face. Scout came home that August afternoon, had prepared a bed, toys, food bowls. She expected chaos, accident training issues, adjustment problems. Instead, Scout moved through the house like he belonged there, and he attached himself to Emma with the intensity of a spiritual bond. That first night, Scout slept on the floor beside Emma's bed, his head resting just at her mattress level. When Emma woke with nightmares, which happened frequently, Scout was there, pressing his warm body against her, anchoring her to the present moment. When she had panic attacks at school, which she couldn't verbalize but which manifested as physical symptoms, Scout seemed to sense the approaching episode and would move closer, grounding her with his weight and warmth. Within weeks, Emma began drawing pictures, something she rarely did, pictures of Scout, pictures of her and Scout together, Scout sleeping, Scout watching her, Scout protecting her, framed them and hung them in Emma's room. Within 2 months, something extraordinary happened. Emma, who hadn't smiled in 2 years, began to smile regularly, not with her voice but with her entire being. She started eating better, sleeping better, becoming less of a ghost and more of a presence. Didn't know it yet, but Scout would eventually become the key to everything, the bridge between Emma's silent world and the speaking world beyond. This broken dog and this broken girl had found something neither could find elsewhere: understanding, acceptance, love without demands. The battle was still to come, but in that August when Scout arrived, hope planted its first real seed. 3 months after Scout arrived at its home, Richard Mitchell filed a petition to modify the existing custody agreement. It came in the form of official court documents that arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped into the mailbox like a knife. Was at school teaching when her lawyer Hayes called, her voice tight and worried. "We have a problem," said without preamble. "Richard's filing for primary custody. He's hired David Thornton." Stomach dropped. She knew that name. David Thornton was Cleveland's most aggressive family law attorney, The kind of lawyer who won cases not through justice but through ruthlessness, through finding vulnerabilities and exploiting them mercilessly. He had a reputation for destroying mothers in custody battles, had to sit down in the faculty lounge to steady herself. "What grounds?" asked, her voice barely steady. "He claims you're not providing Emma with adequate care due to her emotional condition. He's arguing that her selective mutism is worsening under your care, that you're too emotionally invested to make objective decisions, and that he can provide a more stable, structured environment." Almost laughed, a brittle, desperate sound. "That's insane. Scout is the only thing keeping Emma alive emotionally." "I know," said gently, "but we need to prepare ourselves. Thornton doesn't play nice." The man behind the lawsuit. Richard Mitchell had changed significantly since his arrest 2 years prior. The drinking had continued, though more secretly now. He'd done a brief stint in court-ordered counseling and emerged claiming to be reformed. In reality, he'd learned to hide his addiction better, to perform sobriety during supervised visits with Emma. What didn't know was that Richard's new motivation had nothing to do with wanting to be a better father. Jennifer, his girlfriend, had left him 6 months ago after discovering he'd been unfaithful. Alone again, Richard had started dating a woman named, a successful CPA 5 years his senior who came from money, had made it clear that Richard's financial obligations to and Emma were a problem. "You're throwing away 20% of your income on a kid who won't even talk to you," had said during one of their dinners. "That's insane. Get custody, reduce the payments, and we can finally take that trip to." Richard, financially struggling and emotionally manipulated, saw it clearly now. Reducing child support payments could solve his problems, and if he could paint as an unfit mother, he could justify his actions to himself and others. The first call he made was to David Thornton's office. The strategy session. David Thornton's office occupied the entire 42nd floor of the tower in downtown Columbus. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. The man himself was intimidating, silver-haired, expensive suit, eyes like a shark. He listened to Richard's story without taking notes, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. "So your ex-wife has your daughter living with this dog," Thornton said slowly. "The child has a psychological condition, selective mutism." "Right, she won't speak, and claims it's because of me but really is coddling her, enabling this behavior by bringing in the animal." Thornton smiled, a cold, predatory smile. "This is actually perfect. We have multiple angles of attack." He began packing, his mind already dissecting the situation for maximum advantage. "First, we argue that the child is emotionally unstable and regressing. We get expert testimony that she's becoming more dependent on the animal, not less. We frame the dog not as help, but as a crutch enabling avoidance of real therapy." "Exactly," Richard said eagerly. "Second," Thornton continued, "we argue that judgment is compromised. She's making decisions based on emotion rather than clinical evidence. An unstable mother for an unstable child creates a dangerous spiral. Third, and this is the key, we introduce doubt about whether has the psychological strength to handle your daughter's condition long-term. Children with selective mutism have high rates of developing social anxiety, depression, other conditions. Does have the resources, the objectivity, the clinical approach necessary." Richard nodded, though he understood only half of what Thornton was saying. "What are your finances like?" Thornton asked. "Decent. I make about $95,000 a year. I've got a new partner who's more financially stable. I could provide more structure, private therapy, tutoring." Thornton's eyes gleamed. "Perfect. We position you as the structured, financially responsible parent who can afford comprehensive care. We position her as an emotional wreck barely keeping things together." He paused. "What's the current arrangement?" "She has primary custody. I get Emma 1 weekend a month and 1 week in summer." "That's going to work in our favor. We argue she's had 2 years to help Emma, and Emma's condition has barely improved or gotten worse. That's grounds for change of custody. Thornton smiled that shark smile again. I want $50,000 retainer. We'll likely need $100,000 total to do this right. Expert witnesses, depositions, discovery, trial if necessary. But we can get you primary custody. And once we do, child support goes down significantly. Especially if we can argue that Emma's emotional needs make her more expensive to care for, justifying higher support to you. Richard felt a flutter of unease at the casual cynicism, but he pushed it down. What are the chances? I've won 78% of custody battles I've taken on. Your ex-wife is teaching high school, financially limited, emotionally invested to the point of poor judgment, and relying on a dog instead of real therapeutic protocols. We're going to make her look like a woman who's in over her head. That conversation happened in March. By April, the legal papers had been filed. CATHRN's terror. His hands shook as she sat across from Hayes in her modest law office, was competent, thorough, knowledgeable about family law, but she was working solo out of a small office building. She didn't have Thornton's resources or his reputation for ruthlessness. Thornton is going to come at us hard, explained, reviewing the petition carefully. He's going to hire expensive expert witnesses who will testify that Scout is harmful to Emma's development. He's going to argue that you're using the dog as a substitute for proper medical intervention. But that's not true, protested. Emma has therapy. Emma's been in therapy for 2 years. The dog is helping her, not replacing therapy. I know, but Thornton will argue that we can't prove causation. He'll say Emma might have improved anyway. He'll introduce doubt. Looked it directly. I need to be honest with you. This is going to be expensive. My rate is $250 an hour. A full custody battle could cost $15,000 to $30,000, possibly more if we go to trial. Thornton is expensive, which means Richard has money or backing. Do you have those resources? Felt her chest tighten. She had $8,000 in savings. Not really. Sighed. We might be able to negotiate a settlement, but Thornton doesn't negotiate from weakness. He negotiates from strength, and right now he feels strong. The weight of fear. For the first time since Scout's arrival, felt the darkness creeping back. Not for herself, but for Emma. She lay awake at night, running scenarios. If Richard won custody, would he let Emma keep Scout? His petition specifically mentioned that the dog was a problem. He could force her to give up Scout. The thought was unbearable. Began documenting everything, Emma's progress, her interactions with Scout, her improved eating and sleeping habits. She took photographs. She recorded observations. She was preparing for war, and she didn't even know if she had the weapons to fight it. Emma seemed to sense her mother's anxiety. Scout did too. The dog moved between them constantly, anchoring them both, trying to hold the family together through sheer force of will. Started second-guessing every decision. Should she have sought more intensive therapy? Should she not have gotten Scout? Was she being selfish by wanting to keep her daughter and the dog together? One night, held Emma close as they watched Scout sleep on his bed in the corner of the living room. I'm not going to let him take you away, whispered to her daughter. I don't know how, but I'm not going to let it happen. Emma, unable to speak, squeezed her mother's hand with a strength that surprised. In that grip was a plea, a promise, and a prayer all combined. The battle was coming, and knew that Thornton, ruthless, expensive, and completely confident, was going to make her fight for every inch of ground. The deposition took place on a humid June morning in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and desperation. Sat at a long table across from David Thornton, with Hayes beside her taking notes. A court reporter sat at the end, recording every word. Thornton began with calculated courtesy, the kind that made your skin crawl because you knew it was a weapon being sharpened. Mrs. Mitchell, let's talk about Emma's condition. When did you first notice the selective mutism? After the incident with her father, replied carefully, glancing at, when she was exposed to his rage and violence. You mean the incident that resulted in no charges being filed? Thornton smiled slightly. The incident where your daughter's testimony would have been needed, but conveniently, she stopped speaking. Interjected sharply, that's argumentative. My apologies, Thornton said without sincerity. Let me rephrase. Mrs. Mitchell, in the 2 years since this incident, has Emma's condition improved. Hesitated, she's made progress with Scout. But she still doesn't speak, correct? No, but... Yes or no, Mrs. Mitchell, she does not speak. She doesn't speak verbally, but she communicates. That's not a yes or no answer. She does not speak, correct? Correct, said quietly, feeling her authority eroding with each word. Thornton spent 3 hours methodically deconstructing his understanding of Emma's condition. He questioned her parenting decisions, her choice to get Scout, her financial resources, her emotional stability. By the end, felt hollowed out. Thornton's final questions were the most damaging. Mrs. Mitchell, do you have any clinical training in psychology? No. Any training in animal behavior therapy? No. Any training in treating childhood trauma? No. Yet you're making all the clinical decisions regarding your daughter's care based on what? Intuition. Based on what her therapists recommend and what I see helping Emma, said, her voice steadier than she felt. You're basing critical medical decisions on your observations and your feelings, not on clinical evidence or professional guidance. Objected, but the damage was done. The court reporter's fingers had captured every word. The expert witnesses arrive. 2 weeks later, attended her own psychologist's deposition, Dr. Martinez, Emma's treating therapist for 2 years. Martinez was articulate and passionate about his work. He that Scout had demonstrably improved Emma's anxiety levels, her sleep quality, her overall affect. In my clinical judgment, Martinez said firmly, Scout is not a distraction from therapy. Scout is part of the therapy. The dog provides what I call bridging support. It allows Emma to regulate her nervous system enough to engage in other therapeutic work. Thornton listened, took notes, and then systematically dismantled Martinez's credibility. Dr. Martinez, your degree is from Ohio State, correct? Yes. Not Yale, not one of the top-tier psychology programs. Ohio State has an excellent program. I asked a simple question. You haven't published research on animal-assisted therapy for selective mutism, have you? Not formally published, but... That's a no. You've been working with Emma for 2 years and she still doesn't speak. By what metric is that considered successful? Martinez tried to explain that progress with selective mutism wasn't measured by immediate speech recovery, but Thornton had planted seeds of doubt in the judge's mind. Then came Thornton's own expert. Doctor arrived from Johns with impeccable credentials, dozens of published papers, speaking engagements at major conferences, a reputation in clinical psychology circles. She had been hired specifically to contradict Dr. Martinez's approach. Her testimony was devastating. In my professional opinion, Doctor stated with absolute conviction, the introduction of the dog into Emma's life has likely prolonged her selective mutism rather than aided it. Children with trauma-based anxiety disorders require structured clinical intervention, not emotional substitutes. Hayes leaned forward intently. What do you mean by emotional substitutes? The dog functions as an avoidance mechanism, explained. Emma has learned that instead of confronting her anxiety and processing her trauma, she can simply lean on the dog for comfort. This is textbook avoidance behavior. By age 12 or 13, if this pattern continues, Emma will have severely impaired social development. She'll struggle to form peer relationships. She may develop agoraphobia. The dependency on the animal becomes entrenched. Saturni tried to counter during cross-examination. Doctor, You've never actually met Emma, correct? No, I review case files and clinical notes. And you're making a diagnosis based on documentation rather than direct observation. That's a standard practice in forensic psychology, replied coolly. But could see Judge nodding slightly as he took notes. He was buying it. The unraveling. Over the summer, the pressure intensified. Thornton filed motion after motion. He requested comprehensive psychiatric evaluations of Emma, not for her benefit, but to create a paper trail suggesting her condition was worsening. He had Emma undergo neuropsychological testing, examining her for developmental delays, behavioral disorders, anything that could be used as evidence that parenting was inadequate. Tried to shield Emma from the reality of the battle, but children are intuitive creatures. Emma began having more anxiety attacks. She stopped eating breakfast some mornings. She clung to Scout even more desperately, as if the dog might disappear at any moment. One night found Emma lying in bed, Scout's head on her chest, both of them staring at the ceiling in the darkness. His heart broke at the sight. This was a child living under the shadow of potential loss. His own mental health began deteriorating. She started taking anxiety medication. She lost weight. She couldn't focus on teaching. Her students noticed she was distracted, disconnected. Her principal called her into his office in July, expressing concern about her performance. "Is everything okay?" he asked gently. She couldn't tell him. What could she say? That she was fighting for custody of her traumatized daughter against a ruthless lawyer who was systematically destroying her credibility. Hayes called regularly with updates, none of them good. "The judge receives report," said one afternoon. "It's thorough and damaging. She's recommending that Emma be removed from your primary custody and placed with a clinical psychologist-approved guardian while you undergo parenting evaluation." Felt the floor drop away. Can she do that? In recommendations, yes, but has to decide if he'll adopt her recommendations into the custody ruling. That's where our argument comes in. The hearing approaches. In August, a hearing was scheduled to present arguments before the formal custody trial. This was Thornton's dress rehearsal, an opportunity to test his evidence and strategy. Sat in the courtroom gallery, Scout with her in a special arrangement had negotiated. Judge sat elevated on the bench, his expression stern and unreadable. Thornton presented his case methodically. He called Richard to testify about his improved circumstances, his new relationship, his commitment to Emma's clinical care. Richard performed his role perfectly, the reformed father desperate to help his troubled daughter. Then Thornton called Doctor. For 2 hours, she about the dangers of animal dependency, the need for intensive clinical intervention, the risks of prolonged selective mutism. Her testimony was articulate, well-reasoned, and completely one-sided. Tried to counter with Dr. Martinez, but Thornton had already poisoned the well with his superior credentials and courtroom presence. As the hearing concluded, Judge's expression had shifted. Could read it in his face, skepticism about her approach, sympathy for Richard's arguments, concern about Emma's condition. "I'll be issuing a preliminary ruling before the trial," Judge announced. "This will give me time to consider the evidence and determine the most likely custody arrangement pending final trial." As they left the courtroom, pulled aside, her attorney's face was grave. "I need to be honest with you. The preliminary ruling will likely favor Richard. Seems convinced by his testimony. When he issues that ruling, it sets the tone for the entire trial. Judges rarely reverse their own preliminary rulings." Felt something inside her break. What does that mean? "It means we need to do something dramatic for the final hearing, something that changes the game completely, because right now we're losing." Desperate measures. That night sat in her kitchen with Emma asleep upstairs and Scout at her feet. She pulled out her laptop and began researching, not legal strategy, but something deeper. She read about selective mutism. She read about animal-assisted therapy. She read about judge psychology and courtroom presentation. Around 2 a.m. an idea formed. It was risky, unconventional, possibly stupid, but she was out of conventional options. She called Hayes, even though it was nearly 3 a.m. "I have an idea," said, "but it's going to sound crazy." There was a pause, then asked how crazy. "Scout-based level crazy." Another pause, "Tell me." And explained what she was thinking. Listened. When finished, her attorney was quiet for a long time. "If we do this and it backfires, we lose Emma. The judge will see it as a manipulation. And if we don't do something, we lose her anyway," replied. Took a breath. "Let me think about it, call me in the morning." Hung up the phone and looked at Scout, who lifted his head and looked back at her with those ancient, knowing eyes. "We're about to take a massive gamble," whispered to the dog. Scout's tail wagged once slowly, with absolute certainty. As if he knew something didn't, kitchen looked like a war room by 7 a.m. Empty coffee mugs accumulated on the counter. Legal documents spread across the table. Hayes sat across from her, laptop open, reading through emails and case law precedents. "Okay," said slowly, removing her glasses and rubbing her eyes. "Let me make sure I understand what you're proposing. You want to bring Scout to the final custody hearing, not as evidence, not as testimony, but as, what? A visual aid." "As a demonstration," corrected, "not of the dog's obedience, but of their relationship, of their communication, of what they mean to each other." Stood and paced the kitchen, thinking out loud. It's unconventional. Courts don't typically allow animals in the courtroom unless they're service animals with specific legal documentation. Judge could refuse outright. "But you could ask," pressed. "Right, at the private chambers meeting before the hearing." "I could. But if I ask and he refuses, we've telegraphed our strategy to Thornton. He'll prepare counterarguments. And if I ask and he allows it, but then the demonstration doesn't work as you hope, we've gambled everything on a performance that can't be taken back." Felt tears pressing at her eyes but forced them back. "We're going to lose anyway. Preliminary ruling will favor Richard. You said it yourself. At least this way we're trying something. At least we're fighting." Sat back down, studying his face. She saw the exhaustion there, the desperation, but she also saw something else. A mother who knew something fundamental about her daughter that no expert testimony could capture. "Tell me more," said finally. "How would this work?" Leaned forward. Scout knows commands, hand signals. Emma trained him. We didn't even know it was happening at first. She'd make subtle gestures and Scout would respond. It started as play, but over time it became this incredible, precise form of communication. It's almost like they have their own language. "And you want to demonstrate this in the courtroom?" "I want the judge to see what we see every day. I want him to understand that Scout isn't a crutch or an avoidance mechanism. Scout is Emma's voice. Scout is how Emma speaks to the world when her own voice won't work." Was quiet for a long moment. "If we do this, we need to prepare carefully. We need to brief Emma on what to expect. We need to ensure Scout will be calm in that environment. We need contingency plans if something goes wrong. And most importantly," she pointed at, "we cannot stage this. We cannot coach Emma to perform. If the judge suspects manipulation, we lose everything." "I know," said. "It has to be authentic. It has to be real." "Then we need to think about what could naturally happen. Not what we want to happen, but what genuinely happens between them." The ethical tightrope. Over the next week, and had multiple conversations about the ethics of what they were proposing. It wasn't jury manipulation. The judge would be the arbiter of fact. But was it fair to put Emma on display in a courtroom? Was it using a traumatized child as a pawn? Consulted with another attorney, a friend she trusted. The conversation happened in his car during lunch break. "You're walking a dangerous line," her colleague Michael said bluntly. If this works, it's brilliant. If it doesn't, you're exploiting a vulnerable child in front of her father's counsel. Thornton will destroy you. He'll file ethics complaints." "I know," said quietly. And does she understand that Emma might be traumatized by the courtroom experience? That this could trigger her anxiety further? Nodded. She'd been wrestling with these exact questions. "But what's the alternative?" asked. "We go to trial with the deck stacked against us, issues a preliminary ruling favoring Richard. We lose custody anyway. Emma loses Scout. Emma loses the only thing that's been keeping her functional. What kind of trauma is that?" Michael didn't have an answer. PREPRNG Emma faced the most difficult conversation of her life the following Saturday. She sat on Emma's bed, with Scout's head resting on Emma's lap, and tried to explain what was happening in terms a 9-year-old could understand. "Emma, I need to talk to you about something very important," began. Emma's eyes went immediately cautious. Children who experience trauma become hypervigilant to parental conversations that start this way. Took a breath. "You know that your dad and I have been talking to lawyers about custody, right?" Emma nodded, her small hand moving to rest on Scout's head. "The judge is going to make a decision about where you live. It's a very important decision, and I want the judge to understand how special you and Scout are together, how much he helps you, how you talk to each other." Emma's breathing had quickened slightly, could see the anxiety rising in her daughter's small frame. "I want to bring Scout to the courthouse, just for one day. I want the judge to see how you and Scout communicate, not to be scary or strange, but just to show him something beautiful." Watched her daughter's face carefully. Emma looked down at Scout, then back at her mother. Could almost see the calculation happening in her daughter's mind, weighing fear against trust, anxiety against the need to protect Scout. Slowly, Emma nodded, pulled her daughter into an embrace, feeling Emma's racing heartbeat against her own chest. "You're so brave," whispered. "So incredibly brave." Training for the courtroom. Over the next 3 weeks and developed a plan. They couldn't rehearse with Emma in the actual courthouse. Thornton would learn about it immediately, but they could prepare in other ways. Began taking Emma to unfamiliar public places. They went to the library during busy hours. They went to a crowded shopping mall. They went to restaurants at peak times. Each outing, Emma would sit quietly while a friend talked, and Scout would remain calm at her side. Also worked with Scout individually. She hired a professional dog trainer, explained the situation, leaving out the custody battle specifics, and had the trainer work with Scout on remaining calm and responsive in high-stress environments. Scout was naturally well-behaved, but courtrooms had unexpected stimuli, sudden voices, unfamiliar people, echoing sounds. The trainer taught Emma refined hand signals, smaller gestures than she normally used, signals that would be visible to a judge across a courtroom but wouldn't look like obvious commands. They practiced for hours. One afternoon, as watched Emma and Scout together, she realized something. They didn't need to practice this. They already had it. The communication between them was so natural, so deeply embedded, that it couldn't be manufactured or performed. Either the judge would see it or he wouldn't, but it would be real regardless. The night before. The evening before the hearing was scheduled, found Emma on the back porch, sitting beside Scout, watching the sunset. Scout's head rested on Emma's lap as the summer light turned golden. Sat down beside them without speaking. They sat like that for almost an hour, 3 beings, bound together by something deeper than biology or law, bound by survival, bound by love. Finally, Emma turned to and pointed to herself, then to Scout, then made a sweeping gesture that seemed to encompass everything. Her mother, their home, their life together. Understood, Emma was saying this, all of this. This is mine, this is what matters. Pulled Emma close. "I know, baby, I know." PATRICIA's final briefing. Called the night before the hearing, after Emma was asleep. I've requested a chambers meeting with and Thornton for 8 a.m., said. Before the hearing. I'm going to make my request then. The judge can grant it or deny it in private, so at least we won't have a public rejection. And if he denies it, then we go to trial as planned. We lose probably, but at least we tried. And if he allows it, then we have 2 hours before the hearing starts to bring Scout to the courthouse and get Emma settled. I'll have briefed the bailiff. He'll have a special area prepared for Scout, a cushion in the courtroom corner, away from most of the activity but visible to the judge. His heart was hammering in her chest. I'm terrified. So am I, admitted. But I've been practicing law for 22 years, and I've never seen a judge completely unmoved by genuine human connection, even a judge as by the book as has a heart somewhere in there. Our job is to reach it. What if we don't? Then we fight the custody order through appeal. We find new evidence. We keep fighting, because that's what you do for people you love. After they hung up, went to Emma's room and watched her daughter sleep, Scout positioned protectively at the foot of her bed. The dog opened one eye as entered, then closed it again, apparently satisfied that the family was safe. Whispered a prayer to a universe she wasn't sure was listening. She thought about Emma's first word in 2 years being Scout's name. She thought about the day ahead, the gamble that could change everything. Then she went to her own room and tried not to think about what could go wrong. Hands were steady as she carried her briefcase into Judge's chambers at 7:55 a.m., even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. David Thornton was already there, standing with Richard Mitchell, both of them radiating confidence. Thornton's Italian suit probably cost more than his entire monthly retainer from. Judge sat behind his imposing desk, reading through documents. He looked up as entered. Ms. Hayes, I'm glad you're here. I wanted to discuss a few procedural matters before the hearing begins. Had prepared for this moment for days. She'd written and rewritten her opening statement. She knew the legal precedents. She knew the emotional arguments. But standing in that room, facing 3 powerful men and her own doubt, she felt something inside her steel itself. Your Honor, before we discuss procedures, I have an unconventional request. Thornton's eyes narrowed immediately. He smelled blood in the water. I'd like to request that my client's emotional support animal be allowed to sit in the courtroom during the hearing. The dog is certified as an emotional support animal for my client's daughter, and I believe his presence is relevant to the proceedings. The silence that followed was profound. Judge set down his pen slowly. Ms. Hayes, you're aware that animals are not permitted in courtrooms except in very specific circumstances. I am, Your Honor, but I'm also aware that judges have discretion to make exceptions when relevant to the proceedings. In this case, the animal's role in my client's daughter's therapeutic recovery is central to the custody determination. Thornton leaned forward. Your Honor, this is clearly an attempt to introduce emotional manipulation into these proceedings. A dog in the courtroom serves no evidentiary purpose. It's exactly the kind of... I'm not asking you, Mr. Thornton, Judge said quietly. I'm considering Ms. Hayes' request. The judge stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Watched him trying to read his expression but unable to. 30 seconds passed. 45. A minute. Finally, Judge turned back. I'm going to grant your request, Ms. Hayes, but with conditions. The animal must remain calm and controlled. If there is any disruption, it will be immediately removed. And understand this. The presence of the animal will not change the legal framework of this case. It will not excuse the lack of clinical evidence supporting your position. Felt something release in her chest. Thank you, Your Honor. I understand completely. Additionally, the judge continued, Mr. Thornton, I'm notifying you now so there are no surprises. This is not an ambush. Thornton's face had gone slightly pale. He clearly recognized this as a tactical disadvantage. His prepared arguments hadn't accounted for this variable. As left the chambers, she allowed herself one moment of cautious optimism. The first barrier had been cleared. The waiting. And Emma arrived at the courthouse at 8:45 a.m. They sat in his office on the third floor, in the building adjacent to the courthouse. Scout lay at Emma's feet, sensing the tension radiating from both females in the room. Had dressed carefully, professional but not cold, maternal but not helpless. She wore a navy blazer and simple gold jewelry. Emma wore a blue dress that had helped her pick out, not too formal, not too casual. The dress was soft and comfortable, the kind Emma could breathe in. Emma's leg bounced nervously, reached over and gently stilled it with her hand. "In about 30 minutes we're going to walk over to the courthouse," said quietly. "We'll show us to the courtroom. Scout will have a special spot prepared for him. You're going to sit at the witness table. I'll be in the gallery where I can see you." Emma's eyes were wide, her breathing shallow. "Emma, I need you to know something," continued, making sure Emma was making eye contact. "You don't have to do anything today except be yourself. You don't have to speak. You don't have to perform. You just have to be here with Scout the way you always are. That's all, just be yourself." Emma reached down and wrapped her arm around Scout's neck. The dog's tail wagged slowly, his entire body language saying, "I am here. I am not going anywhere." The courtroom arrives. By 9:30 a.m. the courtroom was filling up. It was larger than had expected, high ceilings, wood paneling, official-looking and intimidating. The gallery was packed with spectators. A local news reporter sat in the back corner. Word had gotten out that this was an unusual custody case. Sat in the third row of the gallery, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She watched as Scout was settled on a cushion in the corner of the courtroom, far enough away to not distract, but visible enough for the judge to observe. A bailiff had been specially instructed and was treating Scout with professional respect. Richard arrived with Thornton and his girlfriend. Was attractive, polished, exactly the kind of woman wasn't. Felt the inadequacy wash over her, the schoolteacher in her sensible shoes facing down the wealth and sophistication of Thornton's operation. Emma was brought to the witness table by. The child looked impossibly small in the large courtroom. She wore a special microphone so the court could hear her if she chose to speak, though no one expected her to. Her eyes immediately found Scout, and they locked onto each other across the courtroom, a visual connection that seemed to span the entire space. Judge entered and everyone stood. He looked stern and official in his robes. He glanced at Scout once, briefly, then settled into his chair. "Let's begin," he announced. The devastating words. For 2 hours, arguments were presented. Thornton spoke eloquently about Emma's emotional instability, questionable judgment, the need for a structured clinical environment. Richard again about his reformed character and financial capacity. Doctor was recalled and reiterated her concerns. Did her best. She presented Dr. Martinez again, argued about Emma's progress, spoke passionately about the bond between child and animal. But Thornton's arguments were stronger, more polished, more credible to a judge trained in legal precedent rather than emotional truth. Finally, as the afternoon light slanted through the high courtroom windows, Judge announced he was ready to deliver his preliminary ruling. Stomach dropped. Emma's small body went rigid. Scout's head lifted, his senses picking up on the shift in energy in the room. Judge pulled out several pages, cleared his throat and began to read. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, the testimony of expert witnesses and the best interests of the minor child, I find the following. The child, Emma Mitchell, is suffering from a significant psychological condition, selective mutism, that has persisted for 2 years without substantial improvement despite therapeutic intervention. Felt the earth tilting beneath her. I find that the mother, Mitchell, while well-intentioned, has made clinical decisions based on emotional attachment rather than professional guidance. The introduction of the animal into the child's life, while not necessarily harmful, has not resulted in the significant clinical improvement one would expect from a genuine therapeutic intervention. Judge adjusted his glasses and continued reading. I find that the father, Richard Mitchell, has demonstrated financial stability, commitment to clinical intervention, and a capacity to provide a structured environment more conducive to the child's recovery. His vision blurred with tears. Therefore, it is the preliminary finding of this court that primary custody of Emma Mitchell should be awarded to her father, Richard Mitchell. The animal in question should be. That's when Emma made the smallest sound, not words but a gasp, a tiny, desperate gasp of despair. Her small hands began to tremble visibly. Tears rolled down her face in absolute silence. She didn't even have the ability to cry audibly anymore. Scout's body went immediately alert. The moment. With a trembling hand, Emma made the subtlest gesture, a pinch of her fingers, barely visible from more than a few feet away. A downward glance, like she was closing her eyes to a world that was crumbling. Scout's entire demeanor transformed instantly. The German shepherd stood smoothly, his movements precise and controlled. He crossed the courtroom floor and lay down flat, his massive head resting gently on Emma's foot, not touching her lap, just anchoring himself to her physical presence. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Judge's pen froze midair. Emma made another signal, just a soft tap on Scout's head, and the dog's ears perked up, his gaze shifting directly toward the judge with laser-focused intensity. Then another gesture from Emma, her hand rising slowly. Scout lifted his paw with perfect precision and rested it gently on her lap, his claws retracted, his movement controlled with a precision that suggested thousands of hours of practice. Thornton's confident expression faltered. For the first time, saw doubt cross his face. The news reporter in the back row had stopped typing. Everyone in the courtroom was watching this silent conversation unfold, a language spoken without words, understood without explanation. Judge slowly set down his papers. He removed his glasses and leaned forward, studying Emma and Scout with an intensity that suggested something fundamental had just shifted in his understanding. The preliminary ruling hung in the air, unfinished. But in that moment of silence, something was being rewritten that no legal precedent could explain. Everyone in the courtroom felt the shift, though no one could articulate exactly what they were witnessing. It was as if the air itself had changed frequency, tuning into something deeper than legal arguments and expert testimony. Emma's hand trembled as she made another gesture, this one slightly larger than the first, more deliberate. Her fingers uncurled slowly, like a flower opening to sunlight. Scout responded immediately, his massive head lifting from her foot. The dog's ears rotated forward, his entire body language transforming from comfort giver to active participant. Judge leaned forward slightly, his judicial mask slipping just a fraction. His eyes narrowed with focus, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. In the gallery, found herself holding her breath without meaning to. She watched her daughter and dog with the intensity of someone witnessing a miracle, because in many ways it was. These gestures, this communication, had developed over months in the privacy of their home. No one outside their small family had ever seen Emma's true language with Scout so clearly on display. Thornton's perfectly manicured hand froze on the table. His legal pad, filled with notes and arguments, suddenly seemed irrelevant. His eyes shifted between Emma and Scout, trying to understand what he was observing, trying, it seemed, to find a way to discredit it. The sequence UNFOLDS. Emma made a second gesture, subtly different from the first, a gentle downward sweep of her right hand, then a slight rotation of her wrist. Scout immediately responded by turning his head to the left, his ears tracking toward the judge's bench. The dog's attention was now fully focused on Judge, as if Scout understood the importance of the man sitting elevated above the proceedings. A reporter in the back row had started typing again, then stopped, realizing that typing would be disrespectful to what was unfolding. Her phone came out instead, but she kept the camera low, sensing that photographing this moment might somehow diminish its power. Noticed that Richard had gone pale. His girlfriend leaned toward him with a confused expression, whispering something. Richard shook his head, clearly unable to explain what he was seeing. Emma's breathing had steadied. The initial panic that had seized her when the judge began his ruling had transformed into something else: focus, determination, purpose. It was as if Emma had found her voice after all, not in words but in the physical language she and Scout had developed together. Another gesture. This one involved Emma's left hand rising slowly, her palm opening upward like an invitation or an offering. Scout's response was almost impossibly precise. The dog lifted his paw, not in an excited or playful way, but with deliberation and control, and rested it gently on Emma's offered palm. The bailiff, who had been standing near the doorway, stepped closer to the witness stand, instinctively wanting to help, then stopped himself. This wasn't disruption. This was something sacred unfolding. The realization. Judge removed his reading glasses entirely and set them carefully on the bench beside his papers. He rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, a gesture that seemed almost human, vulnerable, the judicial mask completely discarded. "This is trained," he said quietly, more to himself than to the courtroom. But in the profound silence, every word carried weight. Hayes, who had been sitting at her table with growing amazement, suddenly understood what was happening. This wasn't just emotional. This was evidence. This was communication that transcended psychology and expert testimony. This was a relationship so profound, so developed, so deeply embedded in both the girl and the dog that it had become a language unto itself. Thornton was on his feet. "Your Honor, I object to this entire—" "Sit down, Mr. Thornton," Judge said quietly, not taking his eyes off Emma and Scout. There was something in the judge's voice that made Thornton immediately comply. Emma made a third gesture, a series of quick, small hand movements that Scout responded to by shifting his weight, his paw remaining on Emma's palm while his head tilted toward her at a precise angle. The specificity of it was stunning. This wasn't random affection. This was a conversation. Felt tears streaming down her face, but she couldn't look away. Her daughter, her beautiful, broken, silent daughter, was speaking, not with words but with intention and precision that transcended language. Every gesture Emma made elicited a specific response from Scout. The timing was perfect. The communication was flawless. The moment of understanding. Then Emma made a gesture that was different from all the others. She made it slowly, deliberately, with what appeared to be tremendous emotional weight. Her hand opened, palm up, fingers splayed as if offering something precious. Her body language shifted. She leaned forward slightly, her entire being communicating vulnerability and trust. Scout responded by placing his nose gently into her open palm, not licking it, not nuzzling it, just resting his nose there, his breathing synchronized with hers, his entire body language communicating absolute devotion. The courtroom had gone beyond silence. It was as if everyone had stopped breathing. Judge's shoulders shook slightly. He reached for his glasses, then stopped. He removed his hand from the bench and pressed his fingers to his eyes. When his hand came away, his cheeks were wet. A judge, seasoned, professional, trained to remain impartial and unmoved, was crying. Richard's face had gone ashen. His hand found his, seeking comfort that he couldn't provide. Her expression had shifted from confusion to something more profound, recognition, perhaps, of something beautiful and true that stood in direct opposition to the ruthless legal strategy they'd been pursuing. The reporter's camera came up slowly. She snapped a photograph of this moment, Emma with her hand open, Scout's nose in her palm, the judge with tears on his face. It was a photograph that would, to anyone in that courtroom, end up on the front page of the Cleveland Plain Dealer by evening edition, then be picked up by national news outlets within hours. This, Judge whispered, his voice thick and trembling, is not dependency. This is not avoidance. This is not a crutch. He paused, swallowing hard. This is love. The silence that SBEAKS louder. Hayes had stopped taking notes. She was simply watching, understanding that she was witnessing something that transcended legal procedure and evidentiary standards. This was a moment of profound human truth breaking through the framework of law. Emma made one more gesture, a simple one, almost tender. Her free hand moved to Scout's head and gently stroked his ear. Scout's tail wagged once slowly, with what could only be described as joy. The entire courtroom seemed to recognize that they had been present for something extraordinary. The spectators who had come to watch a custody battle found themselves watching something far deeper, a testimony to the power of connection, understanding, and love between two beings. Thornton's face was a study in controlled fury. His strategy had been systematically destroyed not by legal argument but by the simple presence of truth. He could not cross-examine this. He could not discredit this. He could not turn this into evidence of pathology or dysfunction. What he was witnessing was the opposite, evidence of the most profound psychological health, a child who had found her way to communicate despite trauma that had stolen her voice, a dog who had learned to listen when no human could, a relationship that had healed both of them. Judge sat back in his chair, his hands folded, his expression transformed. He looked at Emma directly, really looked at her for what seemed like a long moment. Then he looked at Scout. Then he looked at in the gallery. And in that moment, something shifted in the entire trajectory of the case. The preliminary ruling hung incomplete, suspended in time, waiting for what would come next. Because this truth, this visual, undeniable, profound truth, could not be ignored, dismissed, or explained away by expert testimony or legal precedent. Scout removed his nose from Emma's palm and looked directly at the judge. And the judge, tears still wet on his cheeks, met the dog's gaze. In that moment, the judge's verdict was already written, not in his legal pad, not in his judicial reasoning, but in his heart, which had been broken open by witnessing something he could no longer deny. Judge sat absolutely motionless. Time seemed to have stopped in that courtroom. The air was thick with something none of the legal professionals present had been trained to handle, unvarnished truth. The judge's fingers remained steepled beneath his chin, but his eyes were no longer the cold, analytical gaze of a legal arbiter. They were something else entirely. The eyes of a man who had just witnessed a truth so profound that it shattered the legal framework he'd spent 30 years perfecting. Emma kept her palm open, Scout's nose resting there. Neither moved. The girl and the dog had created a moment of such perfect stillness that the entire courtroom seemed to orbit around them. Judge's left eye twitched slightly, barely perceptible, but there. The only visible sign of the internal earthquake happening inside him. Watched her judge, because in this moment he had somehow become her judge, not in the legal sense, but in the deepest human sense, and she saw the exact moment when everything changed. She saw the wall of judicial detachment crumble. She saw a man in his 60s confronting something his legal training had never prepared him for. The internal reckoning. What was happening in Judge's mind was a complete inversion of his preliminary ruling. Every assumption he'd made was collapsing like a house built on sand. He'd been told by Doctor, the expert with the prestigious credentials, that this relationship was pathological, that it was avoidance, that it was preventing Emma's development. He'd believed the clinical language because it fit into his understanding of how the world worked. Psychology had rules. Pathology could be identified. Disorders could be named and treated. But what he was witnessing, every clinical framework he'd been presented with. This wasn't a girl using a dog to avoid confronting her trauma. This was a girl who had learned a new language to express her trauma in a way her broken voice couldn't. This wasn't dependency in the pathological sense. This was connection in the most profound sense. The judge looked down at his preliminary ruling, still sitting on the bench in front of him. The words stared back at him. I find that the introduction of the animal into the child's life, while not necessarily harmful, has not resulted in the significant clinical improvement one would expect from a genuine therapeutic intervention. He'd written those words. He'd been so certain, so convinced by Thornton's strategy and credentials. He'd been about to separate this child from the only being who understood her. Judge's hands began to shake. The moment of confrontation. Richard Mitchell leaned over and whispered urgently to Thornton, who was still standing, his face flushed with barely controlled anger. "What's happening?" Richard asked, his voice shaking. "What is he doing?" Thornton had no answer. For the first time in this case, he was witnessing something he couldn't control, couldn't argue, couldn't discredit through superior credentials and courtroom tactics. The news reporter in the back had quietly stepped closer, her camera clicking softly. She understood, as reporters often do, that she was documenting a pivotal moment in a public proceeding. This image, the judge with tears on his face, the girl and her dog, the perfect moment of communication, would tell a story that all the legal arguments combined could not tell. Hayes stood slowly. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Whatever was happening in Judge's mind and heart needed to unfold without interruption. The recognition of injustice. Judge suddenly stood, startling everyone in the courtroom. His movement was abrupt, almost violent in its urgency. He stepped down from the bench, something judges virtually never do during proceedings. He approached the witness stand where Emma sat, with Scout's paw still resting on her lap. The bailiff moved instinctively as if to stop him, then hesitated. This was beyond protocol. This was beyond procedure. Judge knelt beside the witness stand, actually knelt, bringing his face nearly level with Emma's. He looked at the child directly, tears still streaming down his weathered face. "Hello, Emma," he said quietly. Emma blinked, her eyes showing fear but also something else. A small spark of hope, as if she wasn't entirely sure what was happening but sensed that something fundamental had shifted. Scout's tail wagged once, his entire body language saying, "It's okay. This man understands." "I'm sorry," Judge whispered. "I'm so very sorry." The entire courtroom had gone completely silent, felt her own tears flowing freely now. She stood without realizing it, as if her body couldn't remain seated while witnessing this moment. Richard stood as well, confusion and something else, perhaps shame, crossing his face. His hand had dropped from his, and she was staring at the scene unfolding at the witness stand with growing understanding of what she'd been part of. The reckoning with self. Judge stood slowly, his hand briefly touching Scout's head in acknowledgement. The dog accepted the touch with grace, his focus returning to Emma. The judge walked back to his bench with heavy steps, the steps of a man who had just made a devastating discovery about himself. He sat down and looked out at the courtroom, his expression one of controlled anguish. "I need to say something on the record," he announced, his voice still trembling slightly. "For the past 2 years, this child has been silent, traumatized, broken by an experience of violence that no child should ever endure. She has found, not through clinical intervention, not through medication, not through the careful application of psychological theory, but through connection, through love, through a relationship with another being who chose to understand her." He paused, collecting himself. "I was about to destroy that. I was about to listen to experts with credentials and statistics and clinical frameworks, and I was about to separate this child from the only being who speaks her language. The only being who understands her, not because she's been trained to understand, but because she has chosen to understand." Thornton sat down heavily in his chair, his face gone pale. "This is what I was about to do," Judge continued. "In the name of clinical best practices and expert testimony, I was about to tell this child, your connection doesn't matter, your language doesn't count, your relationship isn't valid because it doesn't fit into my framework of what is therapeutically acceptable." The judge removed his glasses completely and set them on his bench. Without them, he looked older and more human, less like a judicial authority and more like a person confronting his own fallibility. The transformation. "Doctor, that this relationship was preventing Emma's development," Judge said, his voice growing stronger. "She that by age 15, this dependency would cripple her socially. She with absolute confidence." He looked directly at Thornton. "But she never observed this child with this dog. She never saw what I just saw. She made clinical judgments based on framework and theory, not on observation and truth." Judge leaned forward, his hands flat on the bench. "I've been on this bench for 30 years. I have sent children to homes I believed would be better for them. I have made custody determinations based on financial stability, educational access, clinical best practices. And I have been, more often than I care to admit, wrong about what children actually need." He looked at Emma. "This child needs one thing above all else, the being who speaks her language, the being who understands her, the being who chose to bridge the gap between her silent world and the speaking world. That's not pathology. That's survival. That's love." Judge's voice had become steady now, firm, certain, the voice of a man who had made a decision that transcended legal procedure and embraced something deeper, justice based on truth rather than framework. "I'm going to set aside my preliminary ruling," he announced. "We are going to recess for 1 hour while I write a new ruling based on what I have witnessed here today, not what I've been told to believe, but what I have seen." He looked at Scout. "Because what I have witnessed here today is one of the most profound examples of therapeutic partnership I have ever seen. Not clinical, not theoretical, real." Scout's tail wagged, as if the dog understood that the tide had turned. And in the gallery, put her face in her hands and wept, not with sadness, but with the overwhelming release of a mother who had just seen her daughter's world saved by truth. Judge returned from his chambers exactly 1 hour later. The courtroom had been buzzing with whispered conversations, speculation, and emotion. Reporters had stepped outside to file preliminary stories. The courthouse hallways had filled with legal observers discussing what they'd witnessed. Sat in the gallery, Emma beside her now. Judge had instructed that Emma could sit with her mother during the reading of the new ruling. Scout remained on his cushion, but his alert gaze never left Emma, sensing that something momentous was about to occur. Richard and Thornton sat at the defense table, both looking significantly less confident than they had that morning. His arm had remained linked through Richard's, though her expression had shifted from triumphant to deeply uncertain. Judge entered and took his seat. He had fresh copies of a ruling printed and bound. The document was thicker than the preliminary ruling had been, not just a few pages, but a full analysis. "I want to begin by acknowledging something," Judge said from the bench. "In my preliminary ruling this morning, I was prepared to separate Emma Mitchell from the one relationship that has sustained her through the darkest period of her young life. I was prepared to do this based on clinical theory, expert testimony, and legal framework." He paused, his eyes finding Scout. "That would have been a grave injustice." Hayes squeezed hand. Tears were flowing freely down the attorney's face as well. "I have spent 3 decades on this bench making determinations about what is best for children. I have prided myself on my adherence to precedent, my reliance on expert testimony, my commitment to legal procedure. But this morning, I learned something that no law school could have taught me. Sometimes the most important truths cannot be captured in expert testimony. Sometimes justice requires seeing with your own eyes rather than through the lens of theory." Judge adjusted his papers, and began reading the new ruling. After observing the direct interaction between the minor child, Emma Mitchell, and her emotional support animal, Scout, I have come to understand that the relationship between them is not symptomatic of pathology, but rather evidence of profound psychological resilience and genuine therapeutic partnership. His hand flew to her mouth. The child, Emma Mitchell, has experienced severe trauma that resulted in selective mutism, a condition that rendered her unable to speak for 2 years. Rather than remaining in that state of dysfunction, she has, with the assistance and support of the animal Scout, developed an alternative form of communication. This communication demonstrates intention, precision, and mutual understanding of the highest caliber. The judge looked up from his papers. This is not avoidance of trauma processing. This is creative adaptation in response to trauma. This is survival. This is what psychological resilience looks like in practice. Richard's face had gone ashen. His grip on his arm tightened. Therefore, it is the finding and ruling of this court that primary custody of Emma Mitchell shall be awarded to her mother, Mitchell. Secondary custody is awarded to Richard Mitchell, with supervised visitation until such time as the court deems it appropriate to modify this arrangement. Felt the room spin slightly. Furthermore, Judge continued, Scout is hereby recognized as a certified emotional support animal with full legal protections. Any attempt to separate this child from this animal shall be considered a violation of the therapeutic arrangement that is foundational to the child's psychological. The judge set down his papers and looked directly at Emma. Mrs. Mitchell, you fought for your daughter when the system tried to take her from you. You trusted a connection that others deemed pathological. You were right to do so. He looked at Scout. And you, Scout, you have done what all of us in this legal system aspire to do but so rarely achieve. You have provided genuine help to a person in need. You have asked nothing in return except the privilege of being present. Scout's tail wagged slowly. His head tilted slightly as if acknowledging the judge's words. The aftermath. The courtroom erupted in controlled chaos. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Hayes embraced, both women crying openly. Richard stood and walked out without speaking, following behind him with a mixture of relief and shame on her face. Thornton packed his briefcase with sharp, angry movements, clearly furious that his strategy had been dismantled not through superior legal argument, but through the simple truth of a girl and her dog communicating. Emma, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, simply reached down and wrapped her arms around Scout's neck. The dog leaned into her, his massive frame gentle against her small body. Judge called in to approach the bench. Mrs. Mitchell, he said quietly, I want to apologize personally. I came very close to doing grave harm to your daughter in the name of legal procedure. Thank you for having the courage to trust something that transcended legal framework. Unable to speak, simply nodded. And I want to say something else, Judge continued. In my 30 years, I have learned that the best parenting is not about structure or financial resources or even clinical best practices. It's about knowing your child so deeply that you understand what they need to survive. You knew what Emma needed. You trusted that knowledge. That is the definition of a good mother. Found her voice then, though it was shaking. Thank you, Your Honor, for seeing her, for really seeing her. 6 months later. The house was quiet on a sunny morning in February. Was making pancakes, Emma's favorite, while Scout dozed on his bed in the corner of the kitchen, his ear twitching occasionally as he dreamed. The past 6 months had been transformative. Emma had continued her therapy with Dr. Martinez, but the focus had shifted. No longer was he trying to force her to speak. Instead, they worked on processing the trauma that had stolen her voice in the first place. Emma drew pictures in her sessions. She communicated with hand signals. She existed in her own linguistic world. And she was healing. The panic attacks had decreased. Her sleep had improved. She'd made a friend at school, another quiet girl who didn't seem to mind that Emma didn't speak. They communicated through drawings and games and the simple understanding that comes from shared quietness. But the greatest change was more subtle. Something inside Emma had shifted. The desperate, terrified quality that had characterized her for so long had softened. She moved through the world with more ease, as if Scout's presence had taught her that silence didn't have to mean isolation. Set a plate of pancakes in front of Emma, who was sitting at the breakfast table, Scout's head resting against her leg. "I love you, sweetie," said, as she had said every morning for the past 6 months, ever since the ruling. She said it more often now, as if making up for all the time she'd been too afraid to speak the words, worried that they might trigger Emma's anxiety. Emma looked at her mother, then she looked at Scout. Then she opened her mouth. His breath caught. Emma's lips formed a shape. A sound emerged, not loud, not strong, but present, real, audible. "Scout," Emma whispered. The word hung in the air like a prayer answered. Scout's entire body responded. His tail began wagging with such force that his entire back end moved. He stood and placed his head on Emma's lap, his brown eyes locked with hers. Felt her knees buckle. She sat down hard in the chair beside her daughter. "You spoke," whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Emma, you spoke." Emma's lips curved into a smile, small, tentative, but real. She stroked Scout's head, her hand moving in the same gentle gesture she'd made countless times before. But this time, there were words accompanying the gesture. "Scout," she said again, slightly louder, slightly more confident. Scout's tail wagged faster. Reached over and pulled both of them, her daughter and the dog that had saved her, into an embrace. The three of them sat like that for several minutes, in the quiet kitchen with the morning light streaming through the windows. The voice returns. Over the following weeks, more words came. Not a flood, not a rush of verbal expression making up for 2 years of silence, but a steady, gentle return of Emma's voice. "Good morning, Scout." "I love you, Mommy." "Can we go to the park?" Small words, simple words, but each one was a victory, a reclaiming of something that had been stolen. Documented everything, not for the court, not for anyone else, but for Emma. She started a journal, writing down each new word Emma spoke, each small moment of linguistic breakthrough. She wanted to remember this journey, this return from silence to speech. Dr. Martinez cried when Emma said her first word during their session. The therapist had been working with this child for 3 years, never knowing if she would ever speak again. To witness the return of her voice, grounded in the foundation of her relationship with Scout, was the greatest reward his career could have offered. Judge received a letter from 3 months after the ruling. In it, she had written about Emma's progress, included drawings Emma had made, and most importantly, shared the moment when Emma had spoken Scout's name for the first time. The judge kept that letter on his desk for the rest of his career. Sometimes, during difficult custody cases, he would take it out and read it. It reminded him that justice was not always found in legal precedent or expert testimony. Sometimes, it was found in the quiet moment between a girl and her dog, speaking a language that transcended words. And sometimes, the greatest acts of wisdom a judge could perform was simply to see the truth and have the courage to follow it, even when it meant overturning their own preliminary judgment. Emma Mitchell would go on to overcome her selective mutism entirely by age 12. She would become an advocate for animal-assisted therapy, studying psychology in college with a focus on trauma recovery. She would speak at conferences about her journey from silence to voice. But she would always credit Scout as her first teacher, her first therapist, her first love. And Scout, the broken dog from the rescue shelter, would live out his life as the healed healer, the being who had learned to listen so deeply that he could hear a girl's silent scream and respond with unconditional love. Together, they had proven something that no expert testimony could ever capture: that love, in its form, is more powerful than trauma, more healing than clinical intervention, and more real than any legal framework could ever contain.